Chapter 9 of The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 9. The Sphinx of Lincoln's Inn. At the age of 26, one cannot claim to have attained to the position of a person of experience. Nevertheless, the knowledge of human nature accumulated in that brief period sufficed to make me feel confident that, at some time during the evening, I should receive a visit from Miss Oman. And circumstances justified my confidence, for the clock yet stood at 2 minutes to 7 when a premonitory tap at the surgery door heralded her arrival. "I happened to be passing," she explained, and I forbore to smile at the coincidence, "so I thought I might as well drop in and hear what you wanted to ask me about." She seated herself in the patient's chair and, laying a bundle of newspapers on the table, glared at me expectantly. "Thank you, Miss Oman," said I. "It is very good of you to look in on me. I am ashamed to give you all this trouble about such a trifling matter." She rapped her knuckles impatiently on the table. "Never mind about the trouble," she exclaimed tartly. "What is it that you want to ask me about?" I stated my difficulties in respect of the supper party, and, as I proceeded, an expression of disgust and disappointment spread over her countenance. "I don't see why you need to have been so mysterious about it," she said glumly. "I didn't mean to be mysterious. I was only anxious not to make a mess of the affair. It's all very fine to assume a lofty scorn of the pleasures of the table, but there is great virtue in a really good feed, especially when low living and high thinking have been the order of the day." "Coarsely put," said Miss Oman, "but perfectly true." "Very well. Now, if I leave the management to Mrs. Gummer, she will probably provide a tepid Irish stew with flakes of congealed fat on it, and a plastic suet pudding or something of that kind, and turn the house upside down in getting it ready. So I thought of having a cold spread and getting the things from outside, but I don't want it to look as if I had been making enormous preparations." "They won't think the things came down from heaven," said Miss Oman. "No, I suppose they won't. But you know what I mean. Now where do you advise me to go for the raw materials of conviviality?" Miss Oman reflected. "You had better let me do your shopping and manage the whole business," was her final verdict. This was precisely what I wanted, and I accepted thankfully, regardless of the feelings of Mrs. Gummer. I handed her £2, and after some protests at my extravagance, she bestowed them in her purse, a process that occupied time, since that receptacle, besides being a sort of miniature record office of frayed and time-stained bills, already bulged with a lading of draper samples, ends of tape, a card of linen buttons, another of hooks and eyes, a lump of beeswax, a rat-eaten stump of lead pencil, and other trifles that I have forgotten. As she closed the purse at the imminent risk of wrenching off its fastenings, she looked at me severely and pursed her lips. "You're a very plausible young man," she remarked. "What makes you say that?" I asked. "The landering about museums," she continued, "with handsome young ladies on the pretense of work. Work, indeed! Oh, I heard her telling her father about it. She thinks you were perfectly enthralled by the mummies and dried cats and chunks of stone and all the other trash. She doesn't know what humbugs men are." "Really, Miss Oman," I began. "Oh, don't talk to me," she snapped. "I can see it all. You can't impose upon me. I can see you staring into those glass cases, egging her on to talk, and listening open-mouthed and bulging-eyed, and sitting at her feet. Now, didn't you?" "I don't know about the sitting at her feet," I said, though it might easily have come to that with those infernal slippery floors. "But I had a very jolly time, and I mean to go again if I can. Miss Bellingham is the cleverest and most accomplished woman I have ever spoken to." This was a poser for Miss Oman, whose admiration and loyalty, I knew, were only equaled by my own. She would have liked to contradict me, but the thing was impossible. To cover her defeat, she snatched up the bundle of newspapers and began to open them out. "What sort of stuff is hibernation?" she demanded suddenly. "Hibernation?" I exclaimed. "Yes. They found a patch of it on a bone that was discovered in a pond at St. Mary Cray, and a similar patch on one that was found at some place in Essex. Now I want to know what hibernation is." "You must mean eburnation," I said, after a moment's reflection. "The newspapers say hibernation, and I suppose they know what they are talking about. If you don't know what it is, don't be ashamed to say so." "Well, then, I don't." "In that case you had better read the papers and find out," she said, a little illogically. And then, "Are you fond of murders? I am awfully." "What a shocking little ghoul you must be!" I exclaimed. She stuck out her chin at me. "I'll trouble you," she said, "to be a little more respectful in your language. Do you realize that I am old enough to be your mother?" "Impossible!" I ejaculated. "Fact," said Miss Oman. "Well, anyhow," said I, "age is not the only qualification. And besides, you are too late for the billet. The vacancy's filled." Miss Oman slapped the papers down on the table and rose abruptly. "You had better read the papers and see if you can learn a little sense," she said severely, as she turned to go. "Oh, and don't forget the finger," she added eagerly. "That is really thrilling." "The finger?" I repeated. "Yes. They found a hand with one missing. The police think it's an important clue. I don't know what they mean, but you read the account and tell me what you think." With this parting injunction she bustled out through the surgery, and I followed to bid her a ceremonious adieu on the doorstep. I watched her little figure tripping with quick bird-like steps down Fetter Lane, and was about to turn back into the surgery when my attention was attracted by the evolutions of an elderly gentleman on the opposite side of the street. He was a somewhat peculiar-looking man, tall, gaunt, and bony, and the way in which he carried his head suggested to the medical mind a pronounced degree of nearsight and a pair of deep spectacle glasses. Suddenly he espied me and crossed the road with his chin thrust forward and a pair of keen blue eyes directed at me through the centers of his spectacles. "I wonder if you can and will help me," said he, with a courteous salute. "I wish to call on an acquaintance, and I have forgotten his address. It is in some court, but the name of that court has escaped me for the moment. My friend's name is Bellingham. I suppose you don't chance to know it? Doctors know a great many people, as a rule." "Do you mean Mr. Godfrey Bellingham?" "Ah, then you do know him. I have not consulted the oracle in vain. He is a patient of yours, no doubt." "A patient and a personal friend. His address is 49 Neville's Court." "Thank you, thank you. Oh, and as you are a friend, perhaps you can inform me as to the customs of the household? I am not expected, and I do not wish to make an untimely visit. What are Mr. Bellingham's habits as to his evening meal? Would this be a convenient time to call?" "I generally make my evening visits a little later than this, say about 8:30. They have finished their meal by then." "Ah, 8:30 then. Then I suppose I had better take a walk until that time. I don't want to disturb them." "Would you care to come in and smoke a cigar until it is time to make your call? If you would, I could walk over with you and show you the house." "That is very kind of you," said my new acquaintance, with an inquisitive glance at me through his spectacles. "I think I should like to sit down. It's a dull affair, mooning about the streets, and there isn't time to go back to my chambers in Lincoln's Inn." "I wonder," said I, as I ushered him into the room lately vacated by Miss Oman, "if you happen to be Mr. Jellicoe." He turned his spectacles full on me with a keen, suspicious glance. "What makes you think that I am Mr. Jellicoe?" he asked. "Oh, only that you live in Lincoln's Inn." "Ha! I see. I live in Lincoln's Inn. Mr. Jellicoe lives in Lincoln's Inn. Therefore, I am Mr. Jellicoe. Ha ha! Bad logic, but a correct conclusion. Yes, I am Mr. Jellicoe. What do you know about me?" "Mighty little, excepting that you are the late John Bellingham's man of business." "The late John Bellingham, hey? How do you know he is the late John Bellingham?" "As a matter of fact, I don't. Only I rather understood that that was your own belief." "You understood? Now from whom did you understand that? From Godfrey Bellingham? And how did he know what I believe? I never told him. It is a very unsafe thing, my dear sir, to expound another man's beliefs." "Then you think that John Bellingham is alive?" "Do I? Who said so? I did not, you know." "But he must be either dead or alive." "There," said Mr. Jellicoe, "I am entirely with you. You have stated an undeniable truth." "It is not a very illuminating one, however," I replied, laughing. "Undeniable truths often are not," he retorted. "They are apt to be extremely general. In fact, I would affirm that the certainty of the truth of a given proposition is directly proportional to its generality." "I suppose that is so," said I. "Undoubtedly. Take an instance from your own profession. Given 1,000,000 normal human beings under 20, And you can say with certainty that a majority of them will die before reaching a certain age, that they will die in certain circumstances and of certain diseases. Then take a single unit from that million, and what can you predict concerning him? Nothing. He may die tomorrow. He may live to be a couple of hundred. He may die of a cold in the head, or a cut finger, or from falling off the cross of St. Paul's. In a particular case, you can predict nothing. That is perfectly true, said I. And then realizing that I had been led away from the topic of John Bellingham, I ventured to return to it. That was a very mysterious affair, the disappearance of John Bellingham, I mean. Why mysterious? Asked Mr. Jellicoe. Men disappear from time to time, and then they reappear. The explanations that they give, when they give any, seem more or less adequate. But the circumstances were surely rather mysterious. What circumstances? Asked Mr. Jellicoe. I mean the way in which he vanished from Mr. Hurst's house. In what way did he vanish from it? Well, of course, I don't know. Precisely. Neither do I. Therefore, I can't say whether that way was a mysterious one or not. It is not even certain that he did leave it, I remarked, rather recklessly. Exactly, said Mr. Jellicoe. And if he did not, he is there still. And if he is there still, he has not disappeared, in the sense understood. And if he has not disappeared, there is no mystery. I laughed heartily, but Mr. Jellicoe preserved a wooden solemnity and continued to examine me through his spectacles, which I, in my turn, inspected and estimated at about -5 diopters. There was something highly diverting about this grim lawyer, with his dry contentiousness and almost farcical caution. His ostentatious reserve encouraged me to ply him with fresh questions, the more indiscreet the better. I suppose, said I, that under these circumstances you would hardly favor Mr. Hurst's proposal to apply for permission to presume death? Under what circumstances? He inquired. I was referring to the doubt you have expressed as to whether John Bellingham is, after all, really dead. My dear sir, said he, I fail to see your point. If it were certain that the man was alive, it would be impossible to presume that he was dead. And if it were certain that he was dead, presumption of death would still be impossible. You do not presume a certainty. The uncertainty is of the essence of the transaction. But, I persisted, if you really believe that he may be alive, I should hardly have thought that you would take the responsibility of presuming his death and dispersing his property. I don't, said Mr. Jellicoe. I take no responsibility. I act in accordance with the decision of the court and have no choice in the matter. But the court may decide that he is dead, and he may nevertheless be alive. Not at all. If the court decides that he is presumably dead, then he is presumably dead. As a mere irrelevant physical circumstance, he may, it is true, be alive. But legally speaking, and for testamentary purposes, he is dead. You fail to perceive the distinction, no doubt? I am afraid I do, I admitted. Yes, the members of your profession usually do. That is what makes them such bad witnesses in a court of law. The scientific outlook is radically different from the legal. The man of science relies on his own knowledge and observation and judgment, and disregards testimony. A man comes to you and tells you he is blind in one eye. Do you accept his statement? Not in the least. You proceed to test his eyesight with some infernal apparatus of colored glasses, and you find that he can see perfectly well with both eyes. Then you decide that he is not blind in one eye. That is to say, you reject his testimony in favor of facts of your own ascertaining. But surely that is the rational method of coming to a conclusion? In science, no doubt. Not in law. A court of law must decide according to the evidence which is before it, and that evidence is of the nature of sworn testimony. If a witness is prepared to swear that black is white, and no evidence to the contrary is offered, the evidence before the court is that black is white, and the court must decide accordingly. The judge and the jury may think otherwise. They may even have private knowledge to the contrary, but they have to decide according to the evidence. Do you mean to say that a judge would be justified in giving a decision which he knew to be contrary to the facts, or that he might sentence a man whom he knew to be innocent? "Certainly, it has been done. There is a case of a judge who sentenced a man to death and allowed the execution to take place, notwithstanding that he, the judge, had actually seen the murder committed by another man. But that was carrying correctness of procedure to the verge of pedantry." "It was with a vengeance," I agreed. "But to return to the case of John Bellingham, supposing that after the court has decided that he is dead he should return alive, what then?" "Ah! It would then be his turn to make an application, and the court, having fresh evidence laid before it, would probably decide that he was alive." "And meantime his property would have been dispersed?" "Probably. But you will observe that the presumption of death would have arisen out of his own proceedings. If a man acts in such a way as to create a belief that he is dead, he must put up with the consequences." "Yes, that is reasonable enough," said I. And then, after a pause, I asked, "Is there any immediate likelihood of proceedings of the kind being commenced?" "I understood, from what you said just now, that Mr. Hurst was contemplating some action of the kind. No doubt you had your information from a reliable quarter." This answer Mr. Jellicoe delivered without moving a muscle, regarding me with the fixity of a spectacled figurehead. I smiled feebly. The operation of pumping Mr. Jellicoe was rather like the sport of boxing with a porcupine, being chiefly remarkable as a demonstration of the power of passive resistance. I determined, however, to make one more effort, rather, I think, for the pleasure of witnessing his defensive maneuvers than with the expectation of getting anything out of him. I accordingly opened out on the subject of the remains. "Have you been following these remarkable discoveries of human bones that have been appearing in the papers?" I asked. He looked at me stonily for several moments and then replied, "Human bones are rather more within your province than mine. But, now that you mention it, I think I recall having read of some such discoveries. They were disconnected bones, I believe." "Yes, evidently parts of a dismembered body." "So I should suppose. No, I have not followed the accounts. As we get on in life, our interests tend to settle into grooves, and my groove is chiefly connected with conveyancing. These discoveries would be of more interest to a criminal lawyer." "I thought you might, perhaps, have connected them with the disappearance of your client." "Why should I? What could be the nature of the connection?" "Well," I said, "these are the bones of a man—" "Yes, and my client was a man with bones. That is a connection, certainly, though not a very specific or distinctive one. But perhaps you had something more particular in your mind?" "I had," I replied. "The fact that some of the bones were actually found on land belonging to your client seemed to me rather significant." "Did it, indeed?" said Mr. Jellicoe. He reflected for a few moments, gazing steadily at me the while, and then continued, "In that I am unable to follow you. It would have seemed to me that the finding of human remains upon a certain piece of land might conceivably throw a prima facie suspicion upon the owner or occupant of the land as being the person who deposited them. But the case that you suggest is the one case in which this would be impossible. A man cannot deposit his own dismembered remains." "No, of course not. I was not suggesting that he deposited them himself, but merely that the fact of their being deposited on his land, in a way, connected these remains with him." "Again," said Mr. Jellicoe, "I fail to follow you. Unless you are suggesting that it is customary for murderers who mutilate bodies to be punctilious in depositing the dismembered remains upon land belonging to their victims, in which case I am skeptical as to your facts. I am not aware of the existence of any such custom. Moreover, it appears that only a portion of the body was deposited on Mr. Bellingham's land, the remaining portions having been scattered broadcast over a wide area. How does that agree with your suggestion?" "It doesn't, of course," I admitted. "But there is another fact that I think you will admit to be more significant. The first remains that were discovered were found at Sidcup. Now Sidcup is close to Eltham, and Eltham is the place where Mr. Bellingham was last seen alive." "And what is the significance of this? Why do you connect the remains with one locality rather than the various other localities in which other portions of the body were found? Well, I replied, rather gravelled by this very pertinent question, the appearances seem to suggest that the person who deposited these remains started from the neighborhood of Eltham, where the missing man was last seen. Mr. Jellicoe shook his head. You appear, said he, to be confusing the order of deposition with the order of discovery. What evidence is there that the remains found at Sidcup were deposited before those found elsewhere? I don't know that there is any, I admitted. Then, said he, I don't see how you support your suggestion that the person started from the neighborhood of Eltham. On consideration, I had to admit that I had nothing to offer in support of my theory, and having thus shot my last arrow in this very unequal contest, I thought it time to change the subject. I called in at the British Museum the other day, said I, and had a look at Mr. Bellingham's last gift to the nation. The things are very well shown in that central case. Yes, I was very pleased with the position they have given to the exhibit, and so would my poor old friend have been. I wished, as I looked at the case, that he could have seen it. But perhaps he may, after all. I am sure I hope he will, said I, with more sincerity, perhaps, than the lawyer gave me credit for the return of John Bellingham would most effectually have cut the Gordian knot of my friend Godfrey's difficulties. You are a good deal interested in Egyptology yourself, aren't you? I added. Greatly interested, replied Mr. Jellicoe, with more animation than I had thought possible in his wooden face. It is a fascinating subject, the study of this venerable civilization, extending back to the childhood of the human race, preserved forever for our instruction in its own unchanging monuments, like a fly in a block of amber. Everything connected with Egypt is full of an impressive solemnity, a feeling of permanence, of stability, defying time and change, pervades it. The place, the people, and the monuments alike breathe of eternity. I was mightily surprised at this rhetorical outburst on the part of this dry, taciturn lawyer, but I liked him the better for the touch of enthusiasm that made him human, and determined to keep him astride of his hobby. Yet, said I, the people must have changed in the course of centuries. Yes, that is so. The people who fought against Cambyses were not the race who marched into Egypt 5,000 years before, the dynastic people whose portraits we see on the early monuments. In those 50 centuries, the blood of Hyksos and Syrians and Ethiopians and Hittites, and who can say how many more races, must have mingled with that of the old Egyptians. But still, the national life went on without a break. The old culture leavened the new peoples, and the immigrant strangers ended by becoming Egyptians. It is a wonderful phenomenon. Looking back on it from our own time, it seems more like a geological period than the life history of a single nation. Are you at all interested in the subject? Yes, decidedly, though I am completely ignorant of it. The fact is that my interest is of quite recent growth. It is only of late that I have been sensible to the glamour of things Egyptian. Since you made Miss Bellingham's acquaintance, perhaps, suggested Mr. Jellicoe, himself as unchanging in aspect as an Egyptian effigy. I suppose I must have reddened. I certainly resented the remark, for he continued in the same even tone. I made the suggestion because I know that she takes an intelligent interest in the subject, and is, in fact, quite well informed on it. Yes, she seems to know a great deal about the antiquities of Egypt, and I may as well admit that your surmise was correct. It was she who showed me her uncle's collection. So I had supposed, said Mr. Jellicoe, and a very instructive collection it is. In a popular sense, very suitable for exhibition in a public museum, though there is nothing in it of unusual interest to the expert. The tomb furniture is excellent of its kind, and the cartonnage case of the mummy is well made and rather finely decorated. Yes, I thought it quite handsome. But can you explain to me why, after taking all that trouble to decorate it, they should have disfigured it with those great smears of bitumen? Ah, said Mr. Jellicoe, that is quite an interesting question. It is not unusual to find mummy cases smeared with bitumen. There is a mummy of a priestess in the next gallery, which is completely coated with bitumen, except the gilded face. Now, this bitumen was put on for a purpose, for the purpose of obliterating the inscriptions and thus concealing the identity of the deceased from the robbers and desecrators of tombs. And there is an oddity of this mummy of Sebek-hotep. Evidently there was an intention of obliterating the inscriptions. The whole of the back is covered thickly with bitumen, and so are the feet. Then the workers seem to have changed their minds, and left the inscriptions and decoration untouched. Why they intended to cover it, and why, having commenced, they left it partially covered only, is a mystery. The mummy was found in its original tomb and quite undisturbed, so far as tomb robbers are concerned. Poor Bellingham was greatly puzzled as to what the explanation could be. "Speaking of bitumen," said I, "reminds me of a question that has occurred to me. You know that this substance has been used a good deal by modern painters, and that it has a very dangerous peculiarity. I mean its tendency to liquefy, without any obvious reason, long after it has dried." "Yes, I know. Isn't there some story about a picture of Reynolds in which bitumen had been used? A portrait of a lady, I think. The bitumen softened, and one of the lady's eyes slipped down onto her cheek, and they had to hang the portrait upside down and keep it warm until the eye slipped back again into its place. But what was your question?" "I was wondering whether the bitumen used by the Egyptian artists has ever been known to soften after this great lapse of time." "Yes, I think it has. I have heard of instances in which the bitumen coatings have softened under certain circumstances and become quite tacky. But, bless my soul, here I am gossiping with you and wasting your time, and it is nearly 8:45. My guest rose hastily, and I, with many apologies for having detained him, proceeded to fulfill my promise to guide him to his destination. As we sallied forth together, the glamour of Egypt faded by degrees, and when he shook my hand stiffly at the gate of the Bellinghams' house, all his vivacity and enthusiasm had vanished, leaving the taciturn lawyer dry, uncommunicative, and not a little suspicious. End of Chapter 9. The Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 10. The New Alliance. The great lexicographer, tutelary deity of my adopted habitat, has handed down to shuddering posterity a definition of the act of eating which might have been framed by a dyspeptic ghoul. Eat, to devour with the mouth. It is a shocking view to take of so genial a function, cynical, indelicate, and finally unforgivable by reason of its very accuracy. For, after all, that is what eating amounts to, if one must needs express it with such crude brutality. But if the ingestion of alimentary substances, to ring a modern change upon the older formula, is in itself a process material even unto carnality, it is undeniable that it forms a highly agreeable accompaniment to more psychic manifestations. And so, as the lamplight, reinforced by accessory candles, falls on the little table in the first-floor room looking on Fetter Lane, only now the curtains are drawn, the conversation is not the less friendly and bright for a running accompaniment executed with knives and forks, for clink of goblet and jovial gurgle of wine-flask. On the contrary, to one of us at least, to wit Godfrey Bellingham, the occasion is one of uncommon festivity, and his boyish enjoyment of the simple feast makes pathetic suggestions of hard times, faced uncomplainingly, but keenly felt nevertheless. The talk flitted from topic to topic, mainly concerning itself with matters artistic, and never for one moment approaching the critical subject of John Bellingham's will. From the stepped pyramid of Saqqara, with its encaustic tiles, to medieval church floors, from Elizabethan woodwork to Mycenaean pottery, and thence to the industrial arts of the Stone Age and the civilization of the Aztecs, I began to suspect that my two legal friends were so carried away by the interest of the conversation that they had forgotten the secret purpose of the meeting, for the dessert had been placed on the table by Mrs. Gummer with the manner of a bereaved dependent dispensing funeral bakemeats, and still no reference had been made to the case. But it seemed that Thorndyke was still playing a waiting game, was only allowing the intimacy to ripen while he watched for the opportunity. And that opportunity came, even as Mrs. Gummer vanished spectrally with a tray of plates and glasses. "So you had a visitor last night, Doctor," said Mr. Bellingham. "I mean my friend Jellicoe. He told us he had seen you, and mighty curious he was about you. I have never known Jellicoe to be so inquisitive before. What did you think of him?" "A quaint old cock. I found him highly amusing. We entertained one another for quite a long time, with cross questions and crooked answers, I affecting eager curiosity, he replying with a defensive attitude of universal ignorance. It was a most diverting encounter." "He needn't have been so close," Miss Bellingham remarked, "seeing that all the world will be regaled with our affairs before long." "They are proposing to take the case into court, then?" said Thorndyke. "Yes," said Mr. Bellingham. "Jellicoe came to tell me that my cousin, Hurst, has instructed his solicitors to make the application and to invite me to join him. Actually, he came to deliver an ultimatum from Hurst, but I mustn't disturb the harmony of this festive gathering with litigious discords." "Now, why mustn't you?" asked Thorndyke. "Why is a subject in which we are all keenly interested to be taboo? You don't mind telling us about it, do you?" "No, of course not. But what do you think of a man who buttonholes a doctor at a dinner party to retail a list of ailments?" "It depends on what his ailments are," replied Thorndyke. "If he is a chronic dyspeptic and wishes to expound the virtues of Dr. Snaffler's purple pills for pimply people, he is merely a bore. But if he chances to suffer from some rare and choice disease, such as trypanosomiasis or acromegaly, the doctor will be delighted to listen." "Then we are to understand," Miss Bellingham asked, "that we are rare and choice products in a legal sense?" "Undoubtedly," replied Thorndyke. "The case of John Bellingham is, in many respects, unique. It will be followed with the deepest interest by the profession at large, and especially by medical jurists." "How gratifying that should be to us," said Miss Bellingham. "We may even attain undying fame in textbooks and treatises, and yet we are not so very much puffed up by our importance." "No," said her father. "We could do without the fame quite well, and so, I think, could Hurst. Did Berkeley tell you of the proposal that he made?" "Yes," said Thorndyke, "and I gather from what you say that he has repeated it." "Yes. He sent Jellicoe to give me another chance, and I was tempted to take it. But my daughter was strongly against any compromise, and probably she is right. At any rate, she is more concerned than I am." "What view did Mr. Jellicoe take?" Thorndyke asked. "Oh, he was very cautious and reserved, but he didn't disguise his feeling that I should be wise to take a certainty in lieu of a very problematical fortune. He would certainly like me to agree, for he naturally wishes to get the affair settled and pocket his legacy." "And you have definitely refused?" "Yes, quite definitely. So Hurst will apply for permission to presume death and prove the will, and Jellicoe will support him. He says he has no choice." "And you?" "I suppose I shall oppose the application, though I don't quite know on what grounds." "Before you take definite steps," said Thorndyke, "you ought to give the matter very careful consideration. I take it you have very little doubt that your brother is dead, and if he is dead, any benefit that you may receive under the will must be conditional on the previous presumption or proof of death. But perhaps you have taken advice?" "No, I have not. As our friend the doctor has probably told you, my means, or rather the lack of them, do not admit of my getting professional advice. Hence my delicacy about discussing the case with you." "Then you propose to conduct your case in person?" "Yes, if it is necessary for me to appear in court, as I suppose it will be, if I oppose the application." Thorndyke reflected for a few moments and then said gravely: "You had better not appear in person to conduct your case, Mr. Bellingham, for several reasons. To begin with, Mr. Hurst is sure to be represented by a capable counsel, and you will find yourself quite unable to meet the sudden exigencies of a contest in court. You will be outmaneuvered. Then there is the judge to be considered." "But surely one can rely on the judge dealing fairly with a man who is unable to afford a solicitor and counsel?" "Undoubtedly, as a rule, a judge will give an unrepresented litigant every assistance and consideration. English judges in general are high-minded men with a deep sense of their great responsibilities. But you cannot afford to take any chances. You must consider the exceptions. A judge has been a counsel, and he may carry to the bench some of the professional prejudices of the bar. Indeed, if you consider the absurd license permitted to counsel in their treatment of witnesses, and the hostile attitude adopted by some judges toward medical and other scientific men who have to give their evidence, you will see that the judicial mind is not always quite as judicial as one would wish, especially when the privileges and immunities of the profession are concerned. Now, Your appearance in person to conduct your case must, unavoidably, cause some inconvenience to the court. Your ignorance of procedure and legal details must occasion some delay, and if the judge should happen to be an irritable man, he might resent the inconvenience and delay. I don't say that would affect his decision. I don't think it would. But I am sure it would be wise to avoid giving offense to the judge. And above all, it is most desirable to be able to detect and reply to any maneuvers on the part of the opposing counsel, which you certainly would not be able to do. This is excellent advice, Dr. Thorndyke, said Bellingham, with a grim smile. But I'm afraid I shall have to take my chance. Not necessarily, said Thorndyke. I am going to make a little proposal, which I will ask you to consider without prejudice as a mutual accommodation. You see, your case is one of exceptional interest. It will become a textbook case, as Miss Bellingham prophesied. And since it lies within my specialty, it will be necessary for me to follow it in the closest detail. Now, it would be much more satisfactory to me to study it from within than from without, to say nothing of the credit which would accrue to me if I should be able to conduct it to a successful issue. I am therefore going to ask you to put your case in my hands and let me see what can be done with it. I know this is an unusual course for a professional man to take, but I think it is not improper under the circumstances." Mr. Bellingham pondered in silence for a few moments, and then, after a glance at his daughter, began rather hesitatingly. "It's very generous of you, Dr. Thorndyke." "Pardon me," interrupted Thorndyke. "It is not. My motives, as I have explained, are purely egotistic." Mr. Bellingham laughed uneasily, and again glanced at his daughter, who, however, pursued her occupation of peeling a pear with calm deliberation and without lifting her eyes. Getting no help from her, he asked, "Do you think that there is any possibility whatever of a successful issue?" "Yes, a remote possibility, very remote, I fear, as things look at present. But if I thought the case absolutely hopeless, I should advise you to stand aside and let events take their course." "Supposing the case should come to a favorable termination, would you allow me to settle your fees in the ordinary way?" "If the choice lay with me," replied Thorndyke, "I should say yes, with pleasure. But it does not. The attitude of the profession is very definitely unfavorable to speculative practice. You may remember the well-known firm of Dodson and Fogg, who gained thereby much profit, but little credit. But why discuss contingencies of this kind? If I bring your case to a successful issue, I shall have done very well for myself. We shall have benefited one another mutually. Come now, Miss Bellingham, I appeal to you. We have eaten salt together, to say nothing of pigeon pie and other cakes. Won't you back me up, and at the same time do a kindness to Dr. Berkeley?" "Why is Dr. Berkeley interested in our decision?" "Certainly he is, as you will appreciate when I tell you that he actually tried to bribe me secretly out of his own pocket." "Did you?" she asked, looking at me with an expression that rather alarmed me. "Well, not exactly," I replied, mighty hot and uncomfortable, and wishing Thorndyke at the devil with his confidences. "I merely mentioned that the solicitor's costs, you know, and that sort of thing. But you needn't jump on me, Miss Bellingham. Dr. Thorndyke did all that was necessary in that way." She continued to look at me thoughtfully as I stammered out my excuses, and then said, "I wasn't going to. I was only thinking that poverty has its compensations. You are all so very good to us, and for my part, I should accept Dr. Thorndyke's generous offer most gratefully and thank him for making it so easy for us." "Very well, my dear," said Mr. Bellingham. "We will enjoy the sweets of poverty, as you say. We have sampled the other kind of thing pretty freely, and do ourselves the pleasure of accepting a great kindness, most delicately offered." "Thank you," said Thorndyke. "You have justified my faith in you, Miss Bellingham, and in the power of Dr. Berkeley's salt. I understand that you place your affairs in my hands?" "Entirely and thankfully," replied Mr. Bellingham. "Whatever you think best to be done, we agree to beforehand." "Then," said I, "let us drink success to the cause. Port, if you please, Miss Bellingham. The vintage is not recorded, but it is quite wholesome, and a suitable medium for the sodium chloride of friendship." I filled her glass, and when the bottle had made its circuit, we stood up and solemnly pledged the new alliance. "There is just one thing I would say before we dismiss the subject for the present," said Thorndyke. "It is a good thing to keep one's own counsel. When you get formal notice from Mr. Hurst's solicitors that proceedings are being commenced, you may refer them to Mr. Marchmont of Gray's Inn, who will nominally act for you. He will actually have nothing to do, but we must preserve the fiction that I am instructed by a solicitor. Meanwhile, and until the case goes into court, I think it very necessary that neither Mr. Jellicoe nor anyone else should know that I am connected with it. We must keep the other side in the dark, if we can." "We will be as secret as the grave," said Mr. Bellingham. "And, as a matter of fact, it will be quite easy, since it happens, by a curious coincidence, that I am already acquainted with Mr. Marchmont. He acted for Stephen Blackmore, you remember, in that case that you unraveled so wonderfully. I knew the Blackmores." "Did you?" said Thorndyke. "What a small world it is! And what a remarkable affair that was! The intricacies and cross issues made it quite absorbingly interesting, and it is noteworthy for me in another respect, for it was one of the first cases in which I was associated with Dr. Jervis." "Yes, and a mighty useful associate I was," remarked Jervis, "though I did pick up one or two facts by accident. And, by the way, the Blackmore case had certain points in common with your case, Mr. Bellingham. There was a disappearance and a disputed will, and the man who vanished was a scholar and an antiquarian." "Cases in our specialty are apt to have certain general resemblances," Thorndyke said, and as he spoke he directed a keen glance at his junior, the significance of which I partly understood when he abruptly changed the subject. "The newspaper reports of your brother's disappearance, Mr. Bellingham, were remarkably full of detail. There were even plans of your house and that of Mr. Hurst. Do you know who supplied the information?" "No, I don't," replied Mr. Bellingham. "I know that I didn't. Some newspaper men came to me for information, but I sent them packing. So, I understand, did Hurst. As for Jellicoe, you might as well cross-examine an oyster." "Well," said Thorndyke, "the pressmen have queer methods of getting 'copy,' but still, someone must have given them that description of your brother and those plans. It would be interesting to know who it was. However, we don't know, and now let us dismiss these legal topics with suitable apologies for having introduced them." "And perhaps," said I, "we may as well adjourn to what we call the drawing room. It is really Barnard's den, and leave the housekeeper to wrestle with the debris." We migrated to the cheerfully shabby little apartment, and when Mrs. Gummer had served coffee with gloomy resignation, as who should say, "If you should drink this sort of stuff, I suppose you must, but don't blame me for the consequences," I settled Mr. Bellingham in Barnard's favorite lopsided easy chair, the depressed seat of which suggested its customary use by an elephant of sedentary habits, and opened the diminutive piano. "I wonder if Miss Bellingham would give us a little music?" I said. "I wonder if she could," was the smiling response. "Do you know," she continued, "I have not touched a piano for nearly 2 years. It will be quite an interesting experiment to me, but if it fails you will be the sufferers, so you must choose." "My verdict," said Mr. Bellingham, "is fiat experimentum, though I won't complete the quotation, as that would seem to disparage Dr. Barnard's piano. But before you begin, Ruth, there is one rather disagreeable matter that I want to dispose of, so that I may not disturb the harmony with it later." He paused, and we all looked at him expectantly. "I suppose, Dr. Thorndyke," he said, "you read the newspapers?" "I don't," replied Dr. Thorndyke, "but I ascertain for purely business purposes what they contain." "Then," said Mr. Bellingham, "you have probably met with some accounts of the finding of certain human remains, apparently portions of a mutilated body." "Yes, I have seen those reports and filed them for future reference." "Exactly. Well, now it can hardly be necessary for me to tell you that those remains, the mutilated remains of some poor murdered creature, as there can be no doubt they are, have seemed to have a very dreadful significance for me. You will understand what I mean. And I want to ask you if they have made a similar suggestion to you." Thorndyke paused before replying, with his eyes bent thoughtfully on the floor, and we all looked at him anxiously. "It's very natural," he said at length, "that you should associate these remains with the mystery of your brother's disappearance. I should like to say that you are wrong in doing so, but if I did I should be uncandid. There are certain facts that do, undoubtedly, seem to suggest a connection, and up to the present there are no definite facts of a contrary significance." Mr. Bellingham sighed deeply and shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "It is a horrible affair," he said huskily. "Horrible. Would you mind, Dr. Thorndyke, telling us just how the matter stands in your opinion? What the probabilities are, for and against?" Again Thorndyke reflected a while, and it seemed to me that he was not very willing to discuss the subject. However, the question had been asked pointedly, and eventually he answered: "At the present stage of the investigation, it is not very easy to state the balance of probabilities. The matter is still quite speculative. The bones which have been found hitherto, for we are dealing with a skeleton, not with a body, have been exclusively those which are useless for personal identification, which is in itself a rather curious and striking fact. The general character and dimensions of the bones seem to suggest a middle-aged man of about your brother's height, and the date of deposition appears to be in agreement with the date of his disappearance." "It is known, then, when they were deposited?" asked Mr. Bellingham. "In the case of those found at Sidcup, it seems possible to deduce an approximate date. The watercress bed was cleaned out about 2 years ago, so they could not have been lying there longer than that, and their condition suggests that they could not have been there much less than 2 years, as there is apparently no vestige of the soft structures left. Of course, I am speaking from the newspaper reports only. I have no direct knowledge of the matter." "Have they found any considerable part of the body yet? I haven't been reading the papers myself. My little friend, Miss Oman, brought a great bundle of them for me to read, but I couldn't stand it. I pitched the whole boiling of them out of the window." I thought I detected a slight twinkle in Thorndyke's eye, but he answered quite gravely, "I think I can give you the particulars from memory, though I won't guarantee the dates. The original discovery was made, apparently quite accidentally, at Sidcup on the 15th of July. It consisted of a complete left arm, minus the third finger and including the bones of the shoulder blade and collar bone. This discovery seems to have set the local population, especially the juvenile part of it, searching all the ponds and streams in the neighborhood." "Cannibals!" interjected Mr. Bellingham. "With the result that there was dredged up out of a pond near St. Mary Cray, in Kent, a right thigh bone. There is a slight clue to identity in respect of this bone, since the head of it has a small patch of eburnation. That is a sort of porcelain-like polish that occurs on the parts of bone that form a joint when the natural covering of cartilage is destroyed by disease. It is produced by the unprotected surface of the bone grinding against the similarly unprotected surface of another." "And how," Mr. Bellingham asked, "would that help in the identification?" "It would indicate," Thorndyke replied, "that the deceased had probably suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, what is commonly known as rheumatic gout, and he would probably have limped slightly and complained of some pain in the right hip." "I'm afraid that doesn't help us very much," said Mr. Bellingham, "for, you see, John had a pretty pronounced limp from another cause, an old injury to his left ankle. And as to complaining of pain, well, he was a hardy old fellow and not much given to making complaints of any kind. But don't let me interrupt you." "The next discovery," continued Thorndyke, "was made near Lee, by the police this time. They seem to have developed sudden activity in the matter, and in searching the neighborhood of West Kent they dragged out of a pond near Lee the bones of a right foot. Now, if it had been the left instead of the right, we might have a clue, as I understand your brother had fractured his left ankle, and there might have been some traces of the injury on the foot itself." "Yes," said Mr. Bellingham, "I suppose there might. The injury was described as a Pott's fracture." "Exactly. Well, now after this discovery at Lee, it seems the police set on foot a systematic search of all the ponds and small pieces of water around London, and on the 23rd they found in the Cuckoo Pits in Epping Forest, not far from Woodford, the bones of a right arm, including those of the shoulder, as before, which seemed to be part of the same body." "Yes," said Mr. Bellingham, "I heard of that. Quite close to my old house. Horrible, horrible! It gave me the shudders to think of it. To think that poor old John may have been waylaid and murdered when he was actually coming to see me. He may even have got into the grounds by the back gate, if it was left unfastened, and been followed in there and murdered. You remember that a scarab from his watch chain was found there? But is it clear that this arm was the fellow of the arm that was found at Sidcup?" "It seems to agree in character and dimensions," said Thorndyke, "and the agreement is strongly supported by a discovery made 2 days later." "What is that?" Mr. Bellingham demanded. "It is the lower half of a trunk which the police dragged out of a rather deep pond on the skirts of a forest at Loughton. Staple's Pond it is called. The bones found were the pelvis, that is, the 2 hip bones, and 6 vertebrae, or joints of the backbone. Having discovered these, the police dammed the stream and pumped the pond dry, but no other bones were found, which is rather odd, as there should have been a pair of ribs belonging to the upper vertebra, the 12th dorsal vertebra. It suggests some curious questions as to the method of dismemberment, but I mustn't go into unpleasant details. The point is, the cavity of the right hip joint showed a patch of eburnation corresponding to that on the head of the right thigh bone that was found at St. Mary Cray, so there can be very little doubt that these bones are all part of the same body." "I see," grunted Mr. Bellingham, and he added after a moment's thought, "Now the question is, Are these bones the remains of my brother John? What do you say, Dr. Thorndyke?" "I say the question cannot be answered on the facts at present known to us. It can only be said that they may be, and that some of the circumstances suggest that they are. But we can only wait for further discoveries. At any moment the police may light upon some portion of the skeleton which will settle the question definitely, one way or the other." "I suppose," said Mr. Bellingham, "I can't be of any service to you in the matter of identification?" "Indeed you can," said Thorndyke, "and I was going to ask you to assist me. What I want you to do is this: write down a full description of your brother, including every detail known to you, together with an account of every illness or injury from which you know him to have suffered; also the names and, if possible, the addresses of any doctors, surgeons, or dentists who may have attended him at any time. The dentists are particularly important, as their information would be invaluable if the skull belonging to these bones should be discovered." Mr. Bellingham shuddered. "It's a shocking idea," he said, "but of course you are right. You must have the facts if you are to form an opinion. I will write out what you want and send it to you without delay. And now, for God's sake, let us throw off this nightmare for a little while at least. What is there, Ruth, among Dr. Barnard's music that you can manage?" Barnard's collection in general inclined to the severely classical, but we disinterred from the heap a few lighter works of an old-fashioned kind, including a volume of Mendelssohn's Lieder und Werk, and with one of these Miss Bellingham made trial of her skill, playing it with excellent taste and quite adequate execution. That, at least, was her father's verdict, for, as to me, I found it the perfection of happiness merely to sit and look at her, a state of mind that would have been in no wise disturbed even by Silvery Waves or the Maiden's Prayer. Thus, with simple, homely music, and conversation always cheerful and sometimes brilliant, slipped away one of the pleasantest evenings of my life, and slipped away all too soon. St. Dunstan's clock was the fly in the ointment, for it boomed out intrusively the hour of 11 just as my guests were beginning thoroughly to appreciate one another, and thereby carried the sun, with a minor paternal satellite, out of the firmament of my heaven. For I had, in my professional capacity, given strict injunctions that Mr. Bellingham should on no account sit up late, and now in my social capacity I had smilingly to hear the doctor's orders quoted. It was a scurvy return for all my care. When Mr. and Miss Bellingham departed, Thorndyke and Jervis would have gone too, but noting my bereaved condition, and being withal compassionate and tender of heart, they were persuaded to stay a while and bear me company in a consolatory pipe. End of Chapter 10. Of the Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 11. The Evidence Reviewed. "So the game has opened," observed Thorndyke as he struck a match. "The play has begun with a cautious lead-off by the other side, very cautious and not very confident." "Why do you say 'not very confident'?" I asked. "Well, it is evident that Hurst, and I fancy Jellicoe too, is anxious to buy off Bellingham's opposition, and at a pretty long price, under the circumstances. And when we consider how very little Bellingham has to offer against the presumption of his brother's death, it looks as if Hurst hadn't much to say on his side." "No," said Jervis. "He can't hold many trumps, or he wouldn't be willing to pay $400 a year for his opponent's chance. And that is just as well, for it seems to me that our own hand is a pretty poor one." "We must look through our hand and see what we do hold," said Thorndyke. "Our trump card at present, a rather small one, I'm afraid, is the obvious intention of the testator that the bulk of the property should go to his brother." "I suppose you will begin your inquiries now?" I said. "We began them some time ago, the day after you brought us the will, in fact. Jervis has been through the registers and has ascertained that no interment under the name of John Bellingham has taken place since the disappearance, which was just what we expected. He has also discovered that some other person has been making similar inquiries, which, again, is what we expected." "And your own investigations?" "Have given negative results for the most part. I found Dr. Norbury at the British Museum very friendly and helpful, so friendly, in fact, that I am thinking whether I may not be able to enlist his help in certain private researches of my own with reference to the change effected by time in the physical properties of certain substances." "Oh, you haven't told me about that," said Jervis. "No, I haven't really commenced to plan my experiments yet, and they will probably lead to nothing when I do. It occurred to me that, possibly, in the course of time, Certain molecular changes might take place in substances such as wood, bone, pottery, stucco, and other common materials, and that these changes might alter their power of conducting or transmitting molecular vibrations. Now, if this should turn out to be the case, it would be a fact of considerable importance, medico-legally and otherwise, for it would be possible to determine approximately the age of any object of known composition by testing its reactions to electricity, heat, light, and other molecular vibrations. I thought of seeking Dr. Norbury's assistance because he can furnish me with materials for experiment of such great age that their reactions, if any, should be extremely easy to demonstrate. But to return to our case, I learned from him that John Bellingham had certain friends in Paris, collectors and museum officials, whom he was in the habit of visiting for the purpose of study and exchange of specimens. I have made inquiries of all of these, and none of them had seen him during his last visit. In fact, I have not yet discovered anyone who had seen Bellingham in Paris on this occasion, so his visit there remains a mystery for the present. "It doesn't seem to be of much importance, since he undoubtedly came back," I remarked. But to this Thorndyke demurred. "It is impossible to estimate the importance of the unknown," said he. "Well, how does the matter stand?" asked Jervis. "On the evidence that we have. John Bellingham disappeared on a certain date. Is there anything to show what was the manner of his disappearance?" "The facts in our possession," said Thorndyke, "which are mainly those set forth in the newspaper report, suggest several alternative possibilities, and in view of the coming inquiry, for they will, no doubt, have to be gone into in court, to some extent, it may be worth while to consider them. There are 5 conceivable hypotheses." Here Thorndyke checked them on his fingers as he proceeded. "First, he may still be alive. Second, he may have died and been buried without identification. Third, he may have been murdered by some unknown person. Fourth, he may have been murdered by Hurst and his body concealed. Fifth, he may have been murdered by his brother. Let us examine these possibilities seriatim. First, he may still be alive. If he is, he must either have disappeared voluntarily, have lost his memory suddenly and not been identified, or have been imprisoned on a false charge or otherwise. Let us take the first case, that of voluntary disappearance. Obviously, its improbability is extreme. "Jellicoe doesn't think so," said I. "He thinks it quite on the cards that John Bellingham is alive. He says that it is not a very unusual thing for a man to disappear for a time." "Then why is he presuming for a presumption of death?" "Just what I asked him. He says that it is the correct thing to do, that the entire responsibility rests on the court." "That is all nonsense," said Thorndyke. "Jellicoe is the trustee for his absent client, and if he thinks that client is alive, it is his duty to keep the estate intact, and he knows that perfectly well. We may take it that Jellicoe is of the same opinion as I am, that John Bellingham is dead." "Still," I urged, "men do disappear from time to time and turn up again after years of absence." "Yes, for a definite reason. Either they are irresponsible vagabonds who take this way of shuffling off their responsibilities, or they are men who have been caught in a net of distasteful circumstances. For instance, a civil servant or a solicitor or a tradesman finds himself bound for life to a locality and an occupation of intolerable monotony. Perhaps he has an ill-tempered wife, who, after the amiable fashion of a certain type of woman, thinking that her husband is pinned down without a chance of escape, gives a free rein to her temper. The man puts up with it for years, but at last it becomes unbearable. Then he suddenly disappears, and small blame to him. But this was not Bellingham's case. He was a wealthy bachelor with an engrossing interest in life, free to go whither he would, and to do whatsoever he wished. Why should he disappear? The thing is incredible. As to his having lost his memory and remained unidentified, that also is incredible. In the case of a man who had visiting cards and letters in his pocket, whose linen was marked, and who was being inquired for everywhere by the police. As to his being in prison, we may dismiss that possibility, inasmuch as a prisoner, both before and after conviction, would have full opportunity of communicating with his friends. The second possibility, that he may have died suddenly and been buried without identification, is highly improbable, but as it is conceivable that the body might have been robbed and the means of identification thus lost, it remains a possibility that has to be considered, remote as it is. The third hypothesis, that he may have been murdered by some unknown person, is, under the circumstances, not wildly improbable, but as the police were on the lookout and a detailed description of the missing man's person was published in the papers, it would involve the complete concealment of the body. But this would exclude the most probable form of crime, the casual robbery with violence. It is therefore possible, but highly improbable. The fourth hypothesis is that Bellingham was murdered by Hurst. Now, the one fact which militates against this view is that Hurst apparently had no motive for committing the murder. We are assured by Jellicoe that no one but himself knew the contents of the will, and if this is so, but mind we have no evidence that it is so, Hurst would have no reason to suppose that he had anything material to gain by his cousin's death. Otherwise, the hypothesis presents no inherent improbabilities. The man was last seen alive at Hurst's house. He was seen to enter it, and he was never seen to leave it. We are still taking the facts, as stated in the newspapers, remember, and it now appears that he stands to benefit enormously by that man's death. But, I objected, you are forgetting that, directly the man was missed, Hurst and the servants together searched the entire house. Yes, what did they search for? Why, for Mr. Bellingham, of course. Exactly, for Mr. Bellingham. That is, for a living man. Now, how do you search a house for a living man? You look in all the rooms. When you look in a room, if he is there, you see him. If you do not see him, you assume that he is not there. You don't look under the sofa or behind the piano. You don't pull out large drawers or open cupboards. You just look into the rooms. That is what these people seem to have done. And they did not see Mr. Bellingham. Mr. Bellingham's corpse might have been stowed away out of sight in any one of the rooms that they looked into. That is a grim thought, said Jervis, but it is perfectly true. There is no evidence that the man was not lying dead in the house at the very time of the search. But even so, said I, there was the body to be disposed of somehow. Now how could he possibly have got rid of the body without being observed? Ah, said Thorndyke, now we are touching on a point of crucial importance. If anyone should ever write a treatise on the art of murder, not an exhibition of literary fireworks like De Quincey's, but a genuine working treatise, he might leave all other technical details to take care of themselves if he could describe some really practicable plan for disposing of the body. That is, and always has been, the great stumbling block to the murderer, to get rid of the body. The human body, he continued, thoughtfully regarding his pipe, just as, in the days of my pupilage, he was wont to regard the blackboard chalk, is a very remarkable object. It presents a combination of properties that make it singularly difficult to conceal permanently. It is bulky and of an awkward shape. It is heavy. It is completely incombustible. It is chemically unstable, and its decomposition yields great volumes of highly odorous gases, and it nevertheless contains identifiable structures of the highest degree of permanence. It is extremely difficult to preserve unchanged, and it is still more difficult completely to destroy. The essential permanence of the human body is well known in the classical case of Eugene Aram, but a still more striking instance is that of Seqenen Ra III, one of the last kings of the 17th Egyptian dynasty. Here, after a lapse of 4,000 years, it has been possible to determine not only the cause of death and the manner of its occurrence, but the way in which the king fell, the nature of the weapon with which the fatal wound was inflicted, and even the position of the assailant. And the permanence of the body under other conditions is admirably shown in the case of Dr. Parkman of Boston, USA, in which identification was actually effected by means of remains collected from the ashes of a furnace. Then we may take it, said Jervis, that the world has not yet seen the last of John Bellingham. I think we may regard that as almost a certainty, replied Thorndyke. The only question, and a very important one, is as to when the reappearance may take place. It may be tomorrow, or it may be centuries hence, when all the issues involved have been forgotten. Assuming, said I, for the sake of argument, that Hurst did murder him, and that the body was concealed in the study at the time the search was made, how could it have been disposed of? If you had been in Hurst's place, how would you have gone to work? Thorndyke smiled at the bluntness of my question. You are asking me for an incriminating statement, said he, delivered in the presence of a witness, too. But, as a matter of fact, there is no use in speculating a priori. We should have to reconstruct a purely imaginary situation, the circumstances of which are unknown to us, and we should almost certainly reconstruct it wrong. What we may fairly assume is that no reasonable person, no matter how immoral, would find himself in the position that you suggest. Murder is usually a crime of impulse, and the murderer a person of feeble self-control. Such persons are most unlikely to make elaborate and ingenious arrangements for the disposal of the bodies of their victims. Even the cold-blooded perpetrators of the most carefully planned murders appear, as I have said, to break down at this point. The most insuperable difficulty of getting rid of the human body is not appreciated until the murderer suddenly finds himself face to face with it. In the case you are suggesting, the choice would seem to lie between burial on the premises or dismemberment and dispersal of the fragments. And either method would be pretty certain to lead to discovery. As illustrated by the remains of which you were speaking to Mr. Bellingham, Jervis remarked. Exactly, Thorndyke answered, though we could hardly imagine a reasonably intelligent criminal adopting a watercress bed as a hiding place. No, that was certainly an error of judgment. By the way, I thought it best to say nothing while you were talking to Bellingham, but I noticed that in discussing the possibility of those being the bones of his brother, you made no comment on the absence of the third finger of the left hand. I am sure you didn't overlook it, but isn't it a point of some importance? As to identification, under the present circumstances, I think not. If there were a man missing who had lost that finger, it would, of course, be an important fact, but I have not heard of any such man. Or again, if there were any evidence that the finger had been removed before death, it would be highly important. But there is no such evidence. It may have been cut off after death, and that is where the real significance of its absence lies. I don't see quite what you mean, said Jervis. I mean that, if there is no report of any missing man who had lost that particular finger, the probability is that the finger was removed after death, and then arises the interesting question of motive. Why should it have been removed? It could hardly have been detached accidentally. What do you suggest? Well, said Jervis, it might have been a peculiar finger, a finger, for instance, with some characteristic deformity, such as an ankylosed joint, which would have been easy to identify. Yes, but that explanation introduces the same difficulty. No person with a deformed or ankylosed finger has been reported as missing. Jervis puckered up his brows and looked at me. I'm hanged if I see any other explanation, he said. Do you, Berkeley? I shook my head. Don't forget which finger it is that is missing, said Thorndyke. The third finger of the left hand. Oh, I see, said Jervis. The ring finger. You mean that it may have been removed for the sake of a ring that wouldn't come off? Yes, it would not be the first instance of the kind. Fingers have been severed from dead hands, and even from living ones, for the sake of rings that were too tight to be drawn off. And the fact that it is the left hand supports the suggestion, for a ring that was inconveniently tight would be worn by preference on the left hand, as that is usually slightly smaller than the right. What is the matter, Berkeley? A sudden light had burst upon me, and I suppose my countenance betrayed the fact. I am a confounded fool, I exclaimed. Oh, don't say that, said Jervis. Give your friends a chance. I ought to have seen this long ago and told you about it. John Bellingham did wear a ring, and it was so tight that, when once he had got it on, he could never get it off again. Do you happen to know on which hand he wore it? Thorndyke asked. Yes, it was on the left hand, because Miss Bellingham, who told me about it, said that he would never have been able to get the ring on at all, but for the fact that his left hand was slightly smaller than his right. There it is, then, said Thorndyke. With this new fact in our possession, the absence of the finger furnishes the starting point of some very curious speculations. As for instance, said Jervis. Under the circumstances, I must leave you to pursue those speculations independently. I am now acting for Mr. Bellingham. Jervis grinned and was silent for a while, refilling his pipe thoughtfully, but when he had got it alight, he resumed. To return to the question of the disappearance, you don't consider it highly improbable that Bellingham might have been murdered by Hurst? Oh, don't imagine I am making an accusation. I am considering the various probabilities merely in the abstract. The same reasoning applies to the Bellinghams. As to whether any of them did commit the murder, that is a question of personal character. I certainly do not suspect the Bellinghams after having seen them, and with regard to Hurst, I know nothing, or at least very little, to his disadvantage. Do you know anything? asked Jervis. Well, said Thorndyke with some hesitation, it seems a thought unkind to rake up the little details of a man's past, and yet it has to be done. I have, of course, made the usual routine inquiries concerning the parties to this affair, and this is what they have brought to light. Hurst, as you know, is a stockbroker, a man of good position and reputation. But about 10 years ago he seems to have committed an indiscretion, to put it mildly, which nearly got him into rather serious difficulties. He appears to have speculated rather heavily and considerably beyond his means, for when a sudden spasm of the markets upset his calculations, it turned out that he had been employing his client's capital and securities. For a time it looked as if there was going to be serious trouble. Then, quite unexpectedly, he managed to raise the necessary amount in some way and settle all claims. Whence he got the money has never been discovered to this day, which is a curious circumstance, seeing that the deficiency was rather over £5,000. But the important fact is that he did get it, and that he paid up all that he owed, so that he was only a potential defaulter, so to speak, and discreditable as the affair undoubtedly was, it does not seem to have any direct bearing on this present case." "No," Jervis agreed, "though it makes one consider his position with more attention than one would otherwise." "Undoubtedly," said Thorndyke. "A reckless gambler is a man whose conduct cannot be relied on. He is subject to vicissitudes of fortune which may force him into other kinds of wrongdoing. Many an embezzlement has been preceded by an unlucky plunge on the turf." "Assuming the responsibility for this disappearance to lie between Hurst and the Bellinghams," said I, with an uncomfortable gulp as I mentioned the names of my friends, "to which side does the balance of probability incline?" "To the side of Hurst, I should say, without doubt," replied Thorndyke. "The case stands thus. On the facts presented to us, Hurst appears to have had no motive for killing the deceased, as we will call him, but the man was seen to enter the house, was never seen to leave it, and was never again seen alive. Bellingham, on the other hand, had a motive, as he had believed himself to be the principal beneficiary under the will. But the deceased was not seen at his house, and there is no evidence that he went to the house or to the neighborhood, excepting the scarab that was found there. But the evidence of the scarab is vitiated by the fact that Hurst was present when it was picked up, and that it was found on a spot over which Hurst had passed only a few minutes previously. Until Hurst is cleared, it seems to me that the presence of the scarab proves nothing against the Bellinghams." "Then your opinions on the case," said I, "are based entirely on the facts that have been made public?" "Yes, mainly. I do not necessarily accept those facts just as they are presented, and I may have certain views of my own on the case. But if I have, I do not feel in a position to discuss them. For the present, discussion has to be limited to the facts and inferences offered by the parties concerned." "There!" exclaimed Jervis, rising to knock his pipe out. "That is where Thorndyke has you. He lets you think you're in the thick of the know until one fine morning you wake up and discover that you have only been a gaping outsider. And then you are mightily astonished, and so are the other side, too, for that matter. But we must really be off now, mustn't we, Reverend Senior?" "I suppose we must," replied Thorndyke, and as he drew on his gloves he asked, "Have you heard from Barnard lately?" "Oh, yes," I answered. "I wrote to him at Smyrna to say that the practice was flourishing, and that I was quite happy and contented, and that he might stay away as long as he liked. He writes by return that he will prolong his holiday if an opportunity offers, but will let me know later." "Gad!" said Jervis, "it was a stroke of luck for Barnard that Bellingham happened to have such a magnificent daughter. There, don't mind me, old man. You go in and win. She's worth it, isn't she, Thorndyke?" "Miss Bellingham's a very charming young lady," replied Thorndyke. "I am most favorably impressed by both the father and the daughter, and I only trust that we may be able to be of some service to them." With this sedate little speech, Thorndyke shook my hand, and I watched my two friends go on their way until their fading shapes were swallowed up in the darkness of Fetter Lane. End of chapter 11. Of the Eye of Osiris. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Eye of Osiris by R. Austin Freeman. Chapter 12. A Voyage of Discovery. It was 2 or 3 mornings after my little supper party that, as I stood in the consulting room brushing my hat preparatory to starting on my morning round, Adolphus appeared at the door to announce 2 gentlemen waiting in the surgery. I told him to bring them in, and a moment later Thorndyke entered, accompanied by Jervis. I noted that they looked uncommonly large in that little apartment, especially Thorndyke, but I had no time to consider this phenomenon, for the latter, when he had shaken my hand, proceeded at once to explain the object of their visit. "We have come to ask a favor, Berkeley," he said, "to ask you to do a very great service in the interest of your friends, the Bellinghams." "You know I shall be delighted," I said warmly. "What is it?" "I will explain. You know, or perhaps you don't, that the police have collected all the bones that have been discovered and deposited them in the mortuary at Woodford, where they are to be viewed by the coroner's jury. Now it has become imperative that I should have more definite and reliable information than I can get from the newspapers. The natural thing for me would be to go down and examine them myself, but there are circumstances that make it very desirable that my connection with the case should not leak out. Consequently, I can't go myself, and, for the same reason, I can't send Jervis. On the other hand, as it is now stated pretty openly that the police consider the bones to be almost certainly those of John Bellingham, it would seem perfectly natural that you, as Godfrey Bellingham's doctor, should go down to view them on his behalf." "I should like to," I said. "I would give anything to go. But how is it to be managed? It would mean a whole day off and leaving the practice to look after itself." "I think it could be managed," said Thorndyke, "and the matter is really important for two reasons. One is that the inquest opens to-morrow, and someone certainly ought to be there to watch the proceedings on Godfrey's behalf; and the other is that our client has received notice from her solicitors that the application will be heard in the probate court in a few days." "Isn't that rather sudden?" I asked. "It certainly suggests that there has been a good deal more activity than we were given to understand. But you see the importance of the affair. The inquest will be a sort of dress rehearsal for the probate court, and it is quite essential that we should have a chance of estimating the management." "Yes, I see that. But how are we going to manage about the practice?" "We shall find you a substitute." "Through a medical agent?" "Yes," said Jervis. "Percival will find us a man. In fact, he has done it. I saw him this morning. He has a man who is waiting up in town to negotiate for the purchase of a practice, and who would do the job for a couple of guineas. Quite a reliable man. Only say the word, and I will run off to Adam Street and engage him definitely." "Very well. You engage the locum tenens, and I will be prepared to start for Woodford as soon as he turns up." "Excellent," said Thorndyke. "That is a great weight off my mind. And if you could manage to drop in this evening and smoke a pipe with us, we could talk over the plan of campaign and let you know what items of information we are particularly in want of." I promised to turn up at King's Bench Walk as soon after 8:30 as possible, and my two friends then took their departure, leaving me to set out in high spirits on my scanty round of visits. It is surprising what different aspects things present from different points of view. How relative are our estimates of the conditions and circumstances of life. To the urban workman, the journeyman baker or tailor, for instance, laboring year in and year out in a single building, a holiday ramble on Hampstead Heath is a veritable voyage of discovery; whereas to the sailor the shifting panorama of the whole wide world is but the commonplace of the day's work. So I reflected as I took my place in the train at Liverpool Street on the following day. There had been a time when the trip by rail to the borders of Epping Forest would have been far from a thrilling experience. Now, after vegetating in the little world of Fetter Lane, it was quite an adventure. The enforced inactivity of a railway journey is favorable to thought, and I had much to think about. The last few weeks had witnessed momentous changes in my outlook. New interests had arisen, new friendships had grown up, and above all, there had stolen into my life that supreme influence that, for good or for evil, according to my fortune, was to color and pervade it even to its close. Those few days of companionable labor in the reading room, with the homely hospitalities of the milk shop and the pleasant walks homeward through the friendly London streets, had called into existence a new world, a world in which the gracious personality of Ruth Bellingham was the one dominating reality. And thus, as I leaned back in the corner of the railway carriage, with an unlighted pipe in my hand, the events of the immediate past, together with those more problematical ones of the impending future, occupied me rather to the exclusion of the business of the moment, which was to review the remains collected in the Woodford mortuary, until, as the train approached Stratford, the odors of the soap and bone manure factories poured in at the open window and, by a natural association of ideas, brought me back to the object of my quest. As to the exact purpose of this expedition, I was not very clear, but I knew that I was acting as Thorndyke's proxy and thrilled with pride at the thought. But what particular light my investigations were to throw upon the intricate Bellingham case I had no very definite idea. With a view to fixing the procedure in my mind, I took Thorndyke's written instructions from my pocket and read them over carefully. They were very full and explicit, making ample allowance for my lack of experience in medico-legal matters. 1. Do not appear to make minute investigations or in any way excite remark. 2. Ascertain if all the bones belonging to each region are present, and if not, which are missing. 3. Measure the extreme length of the principal bones and compare those of opposite sides. 4. Examine the bones with reference to age, sex, and muscular development of the deceased. 5. Note the presence or absence of signs of constitutional disease, local disease of bone or adjacent structures, old or recent injuries, and any other departures from the normal or usual. 6. Observe the presence or absence of adipocere and its position, if present. 7. Note any remains of tendons, ligaments, or other soft structures. 8. Examine the Sidcup hand with reference to the question as to whether the finger was separated before or after death. 9. Estimate the probable period of submersion and note any changes, as for example mineral or organic staining, due to the character of the water or mud. 10. Ascertain the circumstances, immediate and remote, that led to the discovery of the bones and the names of the persons concerned in those circumstances. 11. Commit all information to writing as soon as possible and make plans and diagrams on the spot, if circumstances permit. 12. Preserve an impassive exterior. Listen attentively, but without eagerness. Ask as few questions as possible. Pursue any inquiry that your observations on the spot may suggest. These were my instructions, and considering that I was going merely to inspect a few dry bones, they appeared rather formidable. In fact, the more I read them over, the greater became my misgivings as to my qualifications for the task. As I approached the mortuary, it became evident that some, at least, of Thorndyke's admonitions were by no means unnecessary. The place was in charge of a police sergeant, who watched my approach suspiciously, and some half-dozen men, obviously newspaper reporters, hovered about the entrance like a pack of jackals. I presented the coroner's order which Mr. Marchmont had obtained, and which the sergeant read with his back against the wall, to prevent the newspaper men from looking over his shoulder. My credentials being found satisfactory, the door was unlocked, and I entered, accompanied by 3 enterprising reporters, whom, however, the sergeant summarily ejected and locked out, returning to usher me into the presence and to observe my proceedings with intelligent but highly embarrassing interest. The bones were laid out on a large table covered with a sheet, which the sergeant slowly turned back, watching my face intently as he did so, to note the impression that the spectacle made upon me. I imagine that he must have been somewhat disappointed by my impassive demeanor, for the remains suggested to me nothing more than a rather shabby set of students' osteology. The whole collection had been set out by the police surgeon, as the sergeant informed me, in their proper anatomical order, notwithstanding which I counted them over carefully to make sure that none were missing, checking them by the list with which Thorndyke had furnished me. "I see you have found the left thigh bone," I remarked, observing that this did not appear in the list. "Yes," said the sergeant. "That turned up yesterday evening in a big pond called Baldwin's Pond in the Sandpit Plain, near Little Monk Wood." "Is that near here?" I asked. "In the forest up Loughton way," was the reply. I made a note of the fact, on which the sergeant looked as if he was sorry he had mentioned it, and then turned my attention to a general consideration of the bones before examining them in detail. Their appearance would have been improved and examination facilitated by a thorough scrubbing, for they were just as they had been taken from their respective resting places, and it was difficult to decide whether their reddish-yellow color was an actual stain or due to a deposit on the surface. In any case, as it affected them all alike, I thought it an interesting feature and made a note of it. They bore numerous traces of their sojourn in the various ponds from which they had been recovered, but these gave me little help in determining the length of time during which they had been submerged. They were, of course, encrusted with mud, and little wisps of pond weed stuck to them in places, but these facts furnished only the vaguest measure of time. Some of the traces were, indeed, more informing. To several of the bones, for instance, there adhered the dried egg clusters of the common pond snail, and in one of the hollows of the right shoulder blade, the infraspinous fossa, was a group of the mud-built tubes of the red river worm. These remains gave proof of a considerable period of submersion, and since they could not have been deposited on the bones until all the flesh had disappeared, they furnished evidence that some time, a month or 2 at any rate, had elapsed since this had happened. Incidentally, too, their distribution showed the position in which the bones had lain, and though this appeared to be of no importance in the existing circumstances, I made careful notes of the situation of each adherent body, illustrating their position by rough sketches. The sergeant watched my proceedings with an indulgent smile. "You're making a regular inventory, sir," he remarked, "as if you were going to put 'em up for auction. I shouldn't think those snail eggs would be much help in identification. And all that has been done already," he added as I produced my measuring tape. "No doubt," I replied, "but my business is to make independent observations, to check the others if necessary." And I proceeded to measure each of the principal bones separately and to compare those of opposite sides. The agreement in dimensions and general characteristics of the pairs of bones left little doubt that all were parts of one skeleton, a conclusion that was confirmed by the eburnated patch on the head of the right thigh bone and the corresponding patch in the socket of the right hip bone. When I had finished my measurements, I went over the entire series of bones in detail, examining each with the closest attention for any of those signs which Thorndyke had indicated, and eliciting nothing but a monotonously reiterated negative. They were distressingly and disappointingly normal. "Well, sir, what do you make of 'em?" the sergeant asked cheerfully as I shut up my notebook and straightened my back. "Whose bones are they? Are they Mr. Bellingham's, think ye?" "I should be very sorry to say whose bones they are," I replied. "One bone is very much like another, you know." "I suppose it is," he agreed. "But I thought that, with all that measuring and all those notes, you might have arrived at something definite." Evidently he was disappointed in me, and I was somewhat disappointed in myself when I contrasted Thorndyke's elaborate instructions with the meager result of my investigations. For what did my discoveries amount to? And how much was the inquiry advanced by the few entries in my notebook? The bones were apparently those of a man of fair though not remarkable muscular development, over 30 years of age, but how much older I was unable to say. His height I judged roughly to be 5 feet 8 inches, but my measurements would furnish data for a more exact estimate by Thorndyke. Beyond this, the bones were quite uncharacteristic. There were no signs of disease, either local or general, no indication of injuries either old or recent, no departures of any kind from the normal or usual, and the dismemberment had been effected with such care that there was not a single scratch on any of the separate surfaces. Of adipocere, the peculiar waxy or soapy substance that is commonly found in bodies that have slowly decayed in damp situations, there was not a trace, and the only remnant of the soft structures was a faint indication, like a spot of dried glue, of the tendon on the tip of the right elbow. The sergeant was in the act of replacing the sheet, with the air of a showman who has just given an exhibition, when there came a sharp rapping on the mortuary door. The officer finished spreading the sheet with official precision, and having ushered me out into the lobby, turned the key and admitted 3 persons, holding the door open after they had entered for me to go out. But the appearance of the newcomers inclined me to linger. One of them was a local constable, evidently in official charge. A second was a laboring man, very wet and muddy, who carried a small sack, while in the third I thought I scented a professional brother. The sergeant continued to hold the door open. "Nothing more I can do for you, sir?" he asked genially. "Is that the divisional surgeon?" I inquired. "Yes, I am the divisional surgeon," the newcomer answered. "Did you want anything of me?" "This," said the sergeant, "is a medical gentleman who has just got permission from the coroner to inspect the remains. He is acting for the family of the deceased. I mean, for the family of Mr. Bellingham," he added, in answer to an inquiring glance from the surgeon. "I see," said the latter. "Well, they have found the rest of the trunk, including, I understand, the ribs that were missing from the other part. Isn't that so, Davis?" "Yes, sir," replied the constable. "Inspector Badger says all the ribs is here, and all the bones of the neck as well." "The inspector seems to be an anatomist," I remarked. The sergeant grinned. "He's a very knowing gentleman, is Mr. Badger. He came down here this morning quite early and spent a long time looking over the bones and checking them by some notes in his pocketbook. I fancy he's got something on, but he was precious close about it." Here the sergeant shut up rather suddenly, perhaps contrasting his own conduct with that of his superior. "Let us have these new bones out on the table," said the police surgeon. "Take the sheet off, and don't shoot them out as if they were coals. Hand them out carefully." The laborer fished out the wet and muddy bones one by one from the sack, and as he laid them on the table, the surgeon arranged them in their proper relative positions. "This has been a neatly executed job," he remarked. "None of your clumsy hacking with a chopper or a saw. The bones have been cleanly separated at the joints. The fellow who did this must have had some anatomical knowledge, unless he was a butcher, which, by the way, is not impossible. He has used his knife uncommonly skillfully. And you notice that each arm was taken off with the scapula attached, just as a butcher takes off a shoulder of mutton. Are there any more bones in that bag?" "No, sir," replied the laborer, wiping his hands off with an air of finality on the posterior aspect of his trousers. "That's the lot." The surgeon looked thoughtfully at the bones as he gave a final touch to their arrangement, and remarked: "The inspector is right. All the bones of the neck are there. Very odd, don't you think so?" "You mean?" "I mean This very eccentric murderer seems to have given himself such an extraordinary amount of trouble for no reason that one can see. There are these neck vertebrae, for instance. He must have carefully separated the skull from the atlas, instead of just cutting through the neck. Then there is the way he divided the trunk. The 12th ribs have just come in with this lot, but the 12th dorsal vertebra, to which they belong, was attached to the lower half. Imagine the trouble he must have taken to do that. And without cutting or hacking the bones about, either. It is extraordinary. This is rather interesting, by the way. Handle it carefully." He picked up the breastbone daintily, for it was covered with wet mud, and handed it to me with the remark, "That is the most definite piece of evidence we have." "You mean," I said, "that the union of the two parts into a single mass fixes this as the skeleton of an elderly man?" "Yes, that is the obvious suggestion, which is confirmed by the deposit of bone in the rib cartilages. You can tell the inspector, Davis, that I have checked this lot of bones and that they are all here." "Would you mind writing it down, sir?" said the constable. "Inspector Badger said I was to have everything in writing." The surgeon took out his pocketbook, and while he was selecting a suitable piece of paper, he asked, "Did you form any opinion as to the height of the deceased?" "Yes, I thought he would be about 5 feet 8." Here I caught the sergeant's eye, fixed on me with a knowing leer. "I made it 5 feet 8½ said the police surgeon. "But we shall know better when we have seen the lower leg bones. Where was this lot found, Davis?" "In the pond, just off the road, in Lord's bushes, sir. And the inspector has gone off now to—" "Never mind where he's gone," interrupted the sergeant. "You just answer questions and attend to your business." The sergeant's reproof conveyed a hint to me on which I was not slow to act. Friendly as my professional colleague was, it was clear that the police were disposed to treat me as an interloper who was to be kept out of the know as far as possible. Accordingly, I thanked my colleague and the sergeant for their courtesy, and bidding them adieu until we should meet at the inquest, took my departure and walked away quickly until I found an inconspicuous position from which I could keep the door of the mortuary in view. A few moments later I saw Constable Davis emerge and stride away up the road. I watched his rapidly diminishing figure until he had gone as far as I considered desirable, and then I set forth in his wake. The road led straight away from the village, and in less than half a mile entered the outskirts of the forest. Here I quickened my pace to close up somewhat, and it was well that I did so, for suddenly he diverged from the road into a green lane, where for a while I lost sight of him. Still hurrying forward, I again caught sight of him just as he turned off into a narrow path that entered a beech wood with a thickish undergrowth of holly, along which I followed him for several minutes, gradually decreasing the distance between us, until suddenly there fell on my ear a rhythmical sound like the clank of a pump. Soon after I caught the sound of men's voices, and then the constable struck off the path into the wood. I now advanced more cautiously, endeavoring to locate the search party by the sound of the pump, and when I had done this I made a little detour so that I might approach from the opposite direction to that from which the constable had appeared. Still guided by the noise of the pump, I at length came out into a small opening among the trees and halted to survey the scene. The center of the opening was occupied by a small pond, not more than a dozen yards across, by the side of which stood a builder's handcart. The little two-wheeled vehicle had evidently been used to convey the appliances which were deposited on the ground near it, and which consisted of a large tub now filled with water, a shovel, a rake, a sieve, and a portable pump, the latter being fitted with a long delivery hose. There were 3 men besides the constable, one of whom was working the handle of the pump, while the other was glancing at a paper that the constable had just delivered to him. He looked up sharply as I appeared, and viewed me with unconcealed disfavor. "Hallo, sir," he said to me. "You can't come here." Now, seeing that I was actually here, this was clearly a mistake, and I ventured to point out the fallacy. "Well, I can't allow you to stay here. Our business is of a private nature." "I know exactly what your business is, Inspector Badger." "Oh, do you?" said he, surveying me with a foxy smile. "And I expect I know what yours is, too. But we can't have any of you newspaper gentry spying on us just at present, so you just be off." I thought it best to undeceive him at once, and accordingly, having explained who I was, I showed him the coroner's permit, which he read with manifest annoyance. "This is all very well, sir," said he as he handed me back the paper, "but it doesn't authorize you to come spying on the proceedings of the police.
Any remains that we discover will be deposited in the mortuary, where you can inspect them to your heart's content. But you can't stay here and watch us." I had no defined object in keeping a watch on the inspector's proceedings, but the sergeant's indiscreet hint had aroused my curiosity, which was further excited by Mr. Badger's evident desire to get rid of me. Moreover, while we had been talking, the pump had stopped, the muddy floor of the pond being now pretty fully exposed, and the inspector's assistant was handling the shovel impatiently. "Now I put it to you, Inspector," I said persuasively, "is it politic of you to allow it to be said that you refused an authorized representative of the family facilities for verifying any statements that you may make hereafter?" "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean that if you should happen to find some bone which could be identified as part of the body of Mr. Bellingham, that fact would be of more importance to his family than to anyone else. You know that there is a very valuable estate and a rather difficult will." "I didn't know it, and I don't see the bearing of it now."
Neither did I, for that matter.
"But if you make such a point of being present at the search, I can't very well refuse. Only you mustn't get in our way, that's all."
On hearing this conclusion, his assistant, who looked like a plainclothes officer, took up his shovel and stepped into the mud that formed the bottom of the pond, stooping as he went and peering among the masses of weed that had been left stranded by the withdrawal of the water. The inspector watched him anxiously, cautioning him from time to time to "look out where he was treading." The laborer left the pump and craned forward from the margin of the mud, and the constable and I looked on from our respective points of vantage. For some time the search was fruitless. Once the searcher stopped and picked up what turned out to be a fragment of decayed wood. Then the remains of a long deceased jay were discovered, examined, and rejected. Suddenly the man bent down by the side of a small pool that had been left in one of the deeper hollows, stared intently into the mud, and stood up.
"There's something here that looks like a bone, sir," he sang out. "Don't grub about, then," said the inspector. "Drive your shovel right into the mud where you saw it and bring it to the sieve."
The man followed out these instructions, and as he came shoreward with a great pile of the slimy mud on his shovel, we all converged on the sieve, which the inspector took up and held over the tub, directing the constable and laborer to lend a hand, meaning thereby that they were to crowd round the tub and exclude me as completely as possible. This, in fact, they did very effectively with his assistance, for, when the shovelful of mud had been deposited on the sieve, the four men leaned over it and so nearly hid it from view that it was only by craning over, first on one side and then on the other, that I was able to catch an occasional glimpse of it and to observe it gradually melting away as the sieve, immersed in the water, was shaken to and fro. Presently the inspector raised the sieve from the water and stooped over it more closely to examine its contents. Apparently the examination yielded no very conclusive results, for it was accompanied by a series of rather dubious grunts. At length the officer stood up, and turning to me with a genial but foxy smile, he held out the sieve for my inspection.
"Like to see what we have found, Doctor?"
said he. I thanked him and stood over the sieve. It contained the sort of litter of twigs, skeleton leaves, weed, pond snails, dead shells, and freshwater mussels that one would expect to strain out from the mud of an ancient pond. But in addition to these, there were 3 small bones, which at first glance gave me quite a start until I saw what they were. The inspector looked at me inquiringly. Said he. "Yes," I replied, "very interesting."
"Those will be human bones, I fancy,
"I should say so, undoubtedly," I answered.
"Now," said the inspector, "could you say offhand which finger those bones belong to?"
I smothered a grin, for I had been expecting this question, and answered, "I can say offhand that they don't belong to any finger. They are the bones of the left great toe." The inspector's jaw dropped.
"The deuce they are!" he muttered. "I thought they looked a bit stout."
"I expect," said I, "that if you go through the mud close to where this came from, you'll find the rest of the foot." The plain-clothes man proceeded at once to act upon my suggestion, taking the sieve with him to save time. And sure enough, after filling it twice with the mud from the bottom of the pool, the entire skeleton of the foot was brought to light.
"Now you're happy, I suppose,"
said the inspector, when I had checked the bones and found them all present. "I should be more happy," I replied, "if I knew what you were searching for in this pond. You weren't looking for the foot, were you?"
"I was looking for anything that I might find," he answered. "I shall go on searching until we have the whole body. I shall go through all the streams and ponds around here, excepting Connaught Water. That I shall leave to the last, as it will be a case of dredging from a boat, and it isn't so likely as the smaller ponds. Perhaps the head will be there. It's deeper than any of the others." It now occurred to me that as I had learned all that I was likely to learn, which was little enough, I might as well leave the inspector to pursue his researches unembarrassed by my presence. Accordingly, I thanked him for his assistance and departed by the way I had come. But as I retraced my steps along the shady path, I speculated profoundly on the officer's proceedings. My examinations of the mutilated hand had yielded the conclusion that the finger had been removed after death or shortly before, but more probably after. Someone else had evidently arrived at the same conclusion and had communicated his opinion to Inspector Badger, for it was clear that the gentleman was in full cry after the missing finger. But why was he searching for it here when the hand had been found at Sidcup? And what did he expect to learn from it when he found it? There is nothing particularly characteristic about a finger, or at least the bones of one, and the object of the present researches was to determine the identity of the person of whom these bones were the remains. There was something mysterious about the affair, something suggesting that Inspector Badger was in possession of private information of some kind. But what information could he have, and whence could he have obtained it? These were questions on which I could find no answer, and I was still fruitlessly revolving them when I arrived at the modest inn where the inquest was to be held, and where I proposed to fortify myself with a correspondingly modest lunch as a preparation for my attendance at the inquiry. End of chapter 12.